And I used to come to the retreats a few years ago, so this is my first retreat for a few years, and it's amazing to see how many new faces there are amongst some of the familiar faces. So if kind of renewal of the research community is a sign of health, then that's a very good sign for ISSTI. Yeah, so I dodged the question on personal stuff when we did the table review, so I thought I'd put a slide in. So it's not very bright on the screen, but that is my home backyard. I grew up in a place called Heysham in Lancashire, which was kind of a mixture of port and resort. And at the bottom of our road, there was this beach, and then in the 60s onwards, CGB built 2 nuclear power stations on the harbour. So I don't know whether that kind of, in some profound way, has shaped my research interests, but I guess it's informed partly a thinking about an interest in big technologies, you know, these big-scale, large-scale technologies which STIS has spent a long time thinking about. And then my own kind of background in terms of research interests and education has been very interdisciplinary. So that's all right the way from humanities, natural sciences, social sciences. Studied physics originally, then went off to do environmental technology. And then I got into STS when I came up to Edinburgh quite a while ago now to do doctoral research. And I suppose more recently I've been doing innovation studies. So I've moved from STS towards innovation studies. I've also worked in the kind of public and private sectors on research, and that kind of matters to me in terms of the public and private nature of the institutions. So I thought about this. This is I kind of thinking about how differently we would have talked about research as a kind of public exercise if we were doing this 20, 30 years ago, really. But so I grew up in a world of, when I was a schoolboy and going through early thoughts about this stuff, I suppose, it was really a world of public interests, and research was very much a kind of public exercise. And it also was something interesting has changed profoundly about the nature of authority and expertise. So in those days, authority meant politicians, civil servants, union leaders, and academics. Quite a small set of experts, really. And then in expertise, if you were thinking about energy in those days, what you tended to think about was nuclear physics, in terms of research anyway. I ended up studying physics, but also a fairly kind of conventional set of economists and engineers, of course. So the industry was really run by a mixture of nuclear physicists and engineers, the energy industries, the UK energy industries. So this was a kind of stable, hierarchical world with technocrats in charge. And when we're dealing with lots of problems in energy now, this sometimes appears to be quite a kind of attractive way of getting things done, because you can actually make long-term planning under these conditions. So the engineers and the nuclear scientists in the CGB used to write 30-year plans and believe that they might have some influence on making them come true. But there were obviously downsides as well. So how well did this system perform? Well, what Hughes called planning by extrapolation was kind of business, the way things got done. So this is what Johan was talking about in some ways, that the regime tends to project the future as a continuity of existing sets of power interests and technological orientations. Of course, it wasn't such a good system in many ways. It wasn't very transparent, wasn't very accountable, and it wasn't very responsive to change. So there were some particularly poor choices. So we think of the nuclear power program in the UK, that the way that developed led to huge kind of what economists would call, I suppose, misallocation of resources, but just some bad technological choices in many ways. And then there were some things left on the margins, or for other people actively excluded. So those are things, Stuart Russell wrote very well about this in terms of district heating, but also renewables for a long time were excluded in the UK, either actively or just as a normal consequence of vested interest, I suppose. Gas generation itself, So that's less radical, but it was excluded for a long time from people's thinking. And then some broader things about a whole, what I've called here a whole life cycle perspective, but maybe whole systems. So nuclear power spent a lot of time thinking about refining reactor design. It spent almost no time thinking about waste management, end-of-life issues. And then the whole kind of energy efficiency and conservation areas were very much left in the margins in the UK. Things have changed a great deal. So we can think about energy systems very broadly and simply in these terms, different eras of corporatism, market liberalism, and then more recently this thing called a trilemma. I thought I should be the first person to say trilemma because it appears on everybody's energy slides these days. So this has become the conventional way of thinking about these contested drivers of change around decarbonisation, affordability, and security of supply. So we're living in a pretty messy, difficult world in energy at the moment. We're also under this thing which I've written about in terms of accelerated innovation. So there's huge pressures to get things done quickly, which has affected innovation dynamics in the sector. It's not really what I'm talking about today, but I think it has some implications, this broader thinking through about the relationship between STS and IS in terms of the space to be reflexive and critical is actually very difficult now in energy, just because of the urgency and the sense for policymakers after solutions. So this is a slide, again, I kind of put in because perhaps it's reflected on Johan, but these are the worlds that I've been working in the last 5 years when I've been working as research coordinator for the UK Energy Research Centre. So the circle on the left is this kind of big world of urgent problems in energy systems. So it feels like we stumble from crisis to crisis in energy. The urgency never goes away, the urgency just seems to exacerbate. It's a world where the most powerful people are a kind of coalition, or an informal coalition of policymakers, businesses, and consultants. And academics aren't really that influential in this. It's this world of trilemmas and quadrilemmas, if you can bear the term. So multiple difficult to reconcile drivers. And then the large circle at the top on the right-hand side is the world I've been operating in for large parts of the last 5 years, which is this thing around interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary energy studies. So this is a world of economists, system modelers, engineers, psychologists, environmental scientists, right the way across, political scientists, ecologists. This is the kind of disciplines that UKERC works with a lot, the UK Energy Research Centre. And then depicted here as quite sort of on a smaller scale and in the margins perhaps is STIS. So what does STIS say about this kind of problem? Well, it's got really interesting things to say potentially. Those familiar kind of things about the way in which technology is socially shaped and society shaping, getting its hands dirty inside the black box, and the role of technology as both kind of enabling to these big social problems, but also kind of subverting them. So I think about unconventional gas as a kind of subversive innovation in the sustainability cause, but there's loads of others as well. So there's a degree to which we have to think about the kind of controllability and what I think is interesting to think about is the tameability of innovation. How tameable is innovation to the cause of these big policy questions? So a few slides with too many words on really, but this is some literature which talks about this broader issue of interdisciplinarity. And it's a really fascinating literature. I've read more and more of it because I've been helping with a review for UKERC on interdisciplinarity. So there are big statements about the promise of interdisciplinarity, why we need to be interdisciplinary. And this is quite familiar to STIS-oriented people, the costs of specialization and fragmentation. There's a lot of people saying that this matters a great deal with environmental problems, sustainability problems, and I think Johan was saying that as well. So it's understanding complexity, developing a whole systems approach across the big disciplinary areas is key to addressing the problem of climate change. Okay, that's written by an environmental scientist who's been influential in the UK in these large programs. And then in terms of the history of the UK Energy Research Centre, well, UKERC was set up to be straddling these big disciplinary domains, so physical sciences, engineering, environmental sciences, social and economic, and social and political sciences. That's what it was set up to do. Now, there's also a literature on the difficulties of doing this, and again, it's really fascinating. There's lots of kind of reported experience now because people have been trying to do this. So people who've run things like the Tyndall Centre, so Mike Hume is ex-director of the Tyndall Centre, and he reported all kinds of difficulties in getting the Tyndall Centre refunded. It tends to be evaluated in very disciplinary terms by disciplinary experts. This is very familiar things. And then some work on a project that I know Ronan Bolton's been involved with, the Transition Pathways project. So there's some social scientists there who've thought about this problem of interdisciplinarity and how to make it happen in a productive way. And they talk about an almost total divide between engineers and social scientists on interdisciplinary questions. And that social scientists are much more conscious of the big problems involved. And whether the enthusiasm of researchers and also the funding bodies is enough to overcome these quite deep conceptual challenges. It's always easier to write about the challenges of interdisciplinary, I've learned. This literature seems to be quite extensive. But there is an interesting question about engagements with engineers here, which suggests that social scientists are more skeptical about ontological differences, epistemological differences, and that more powerful disciplines have less reasons to be engaged in interdisciplinarity or to be properly engaged with it in a reflexive way. The two bullet points at the bottom there are interesting because they come from a chap called Paul Rouse, who ran ESRC's funding of energy for several years. He's now doing a PhD at Southampton. But he was quite sort of candid about the reluctance of social scientists to engage with natural scientists. Now, I know there's plenty of people in the room who do this, but that is interesting that he's found trying to run a program for the ESRC on this as quite a difficult exercise. So, UK Energy Research Centre, this is just to say that we've got plenty of experience of doing interdisciplinary research, but we haven't been very reflexive about how we do it and whether we're good at it or not relative to others. And so we were encouraged to develop a project on this, and this is what I'm really talking about now for the rest of the presentation. So we've been doing quite conventional things in terms of literature review, workshops, group discussions, online survey, interviews, and we're at the synthesis and dissemination stage. So these are rather preliminary findings, and we're still to really publish on this. But there are a couple of working papers we've written which are available on the UKERC website. So the first thing to say really is that the whole energy funding and institutional landscape has been transformed in the UK over the last 10 years. So that is just the amount of money the research councils have been spending on energy over the last 10 years, sort of, not quite 10 years. UKERC is the whole systems part, and this other line says social, economic and policy, and these are these two lines here. So quite small amounts in the bigger scheme of things, and they haven't really expanded a huge amount, although some of this money is now being spent on more kind of demand-side areas than has been traditional in the UK, so there is some changes. But the interdisciplinary elements of this are quite marginal in terms of funding. UKERC, this is kind of a story of institutional change within UKERC, so I'll not spend a huge amount of time, but when I joined UKERC, it was 2006. It'd been going for a couple of years, and the disciplines weren't really speaking to each other. And this was the organogram that used to appear on UKERC presentations in those days. So we had a fairly kind of network, a grid-type structure. And the idea was that interdisciplinarity would occur at the junctions of the grid, and it wasn't happening. So the UKERC research director, Jim Ski, at that time, decided to tear up the organogram halfway through the phase and invent an integrating project to kind of force interdisciplinary interaction. And this is the sort of network model that he came up with. We worked on that for 2 or 3 years within Phase 1 UKERC. And we came out with an EarthScan collection on the back of that. So it had its successes, it had its achievements, it forced a lot of interaction. It had some weaknesses, so we found that energy system modeling became a kind of organizing template for this project. So we ran into some problems of disciplinary hierarchies. We tended to kind of talk about the things that we could model as well. So some of the more radical changes around the energy system, we had some difficulty representing. A lot of those we found a space for in the next phase of UKERC, in Phase 2. So this is the last 5 years of the centre. A similar kind of broad challenge, to be whole systems, to be interdisciplinary. This time, Phase 2, to have a bigger contribution of social and environmental sciences, was seen as being sort of engineering, economics-led for the first phase. But the Research Council has also insisted on a new funding model, which has been quite a deep influence on the way we've done, we've managed the research program. So like a lot of these other big initiatives, we've run our own flexible funding program. So we had a core program for 5 years, but we've also had half the research money has been spent through competitive research awards, which is the way the research councils tend to do these large awards. So you get the contract, but then you say, right, half your money is to be issued to the wider community, which is interesting and has many kind of advantages because it allows for a flexible and responsive kind of 5-year program. If you were designing a research program for energy over 5 years, it would be quite difficult. You know, we weren't thinking about fracking unconventional gas 5 years ago. It wasn't on anybody's agenda in the UK energy world. The problem is that you're being expected to both be inclusive and flexible at the same time as being integrative and coherent. So this trade-off has been a really difficult one for us over the last 5 years. So we brought in new projects, new people, new disciplines in each funding round. We've also, of course, been working against the backdrop of REF throughout this period. So the quote at the bottom of the slide is just one of our senior researchers. So these are the interviews that we carried out for the Interdisciplinary Review project, saying that in Phase 1 we were integrated, but we were seen as a kind of insiders club. And then Phase 2 was much more inclusive, but not very well integrated. And these have been kind of pretty fundamental problems for us, or trade-offs. So we did a survey of the entire UKERC community and stakeholders as well. And we got about 100 responses, which was great. And what they told us was UKERC was seen as being very applied, very real world, that it had successfully kind of built up the UK's research capacity across the disciplines. And it was also a kind of space for interdisciplinary exchange. We have lots of meetings, workshops to allow that kind of space. But they also said that we tended to be multidisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary. So I'm not sure how familiar these different terms are to people, but so multidisciplinary is the model where the different disciplines kind of rub alongside each other within a big project, but don't really share a lot of methodological or kind of research question issues. The main interdisciplinary experience within Phase 2 UKERC has been small groups of researchers within projects, rather than a large-scale integrated. We haven't found it possible to do this large-scale integrating of the centre in the same way as we were able to in Phase 1, when we had a stable 5-year community of people. We've also been less methodologically innovative than some other initiatives, and I think that's an issue for UKERC going forwards. But I think UKERC tends to be very applied senior researchers who, when we've tried to be a bit more reflexive and methodologically kind of ambitious, that hasn't proven very easy to do. And then, so just to touch on some of the interview findings. So these are kind of about 18 single interviews we carried out with people from all different parts of the centre. Well, there's a kind of fundamental commitment to interdisciplinarity, and that's kind of why people get involved with things like UKERC. So if you were highly disciplinary, monodisciplinary oriented, you probably wouldn't be applying to our research fund, of course. So, and the reasons for that seem to be quite internal, in many ways, that people want to address kind of the big kind of complicated problems, societal problems, and that means joining up with different disciplines. We did ask people about this question of multi, inter, or transdisciplinarity and the balance between them. So transdisciplinarity refers to a much more kind of co-productionist, a co-designed version with non-academic stakeholders. Transdisciplinary means kind of blurring the lines between academics and non-academics. And I thought it was interesting that for some people these distinctions are useful, and for others they don't matter. And it wasn't kind of predictable in terms of the most academic people think that they do matter and the stakeholders think they don't matter. Actually, stakeholders are really interested in these questions of design. And then a rather kind of familiar set of barriers in terms of the challenges of interdisciplinarity. Again, there seem to be a pretty kind of productive part of the interviews where people are really aware of these problems. So that they are things like the extra effort involved, the impact on careers. UKERC has run an interdisciplinary studentship competition, so we've created a small kind of cohort of interdisciplinary postdocs now who are looking for places to go, and they've been supervised across colleges and schools. So there is a particular concern that we're kind of throwing them out into an academic world which is still quite rigidly disciplinary in many respects. So the problem of REF, but also the problem of research councils and the problem of government departments. So there was a lot of people were indicating that the way the research councils kind of co-design or separately design their interests in energy. So we have disciplinary-oriented research councils, which configure a lot of the way the funding is released, but also that different cultures of expertise exist across Whitehall. So DEFRA is seen as particularly kind of science-based, BIS is very industry-based, Treasury is economics-based, and DEC is Department of Energy and Climate Change is a hybrid. There were also, in the interviews with non-academics, some quite notable criticisms of UKERC and other academic initiatives. So particularly, I think this might be a particular sort of energy issue because of the urgency and the difficulty of energy cost, security and environmental problems. But there's a lot of criticism about the academic community, a lack of policy relevance in the way problems are defined and the timing of results, a need for stronger efforts on research co-design, and a perceived lack of enthusiasm to get involved with businesses particularly, amongst part of the UKERC community. And this came across in some of the interviews that academics are actually very cautious in their kind of engagements with business. And that kind of independence of view seems to be an important kind of element for many researchers. And it's curious because, it's not curious, but it's coming up against a very kind of public-private context for funding research in energy. So a lot of the initiatives now coming out of institutions are co-funded, business and the research councils. There's a question for UKERC, which what role for a national centre, given its limited funding, how does it represent the wider community, and this relationship between a sort of national centre identity and individual home institutions identity. Because we were kind of thinking about our next phase of research, we made some recommendations for program design. So this is thinking in terms of how the money is spent on supporting interdisciplinarity, that this requires kind of a more conscious effort than we've tended to. It takes time. It's very much about trust building, that it's quite difficult to metricize interdisciplinary achievement in the same way as more kind of disciplinary-oriented research. And so a kind of sensitivity to the problems and recognizing the outcomes. I think we felt, as we've gone through phase 2, we've become insufficiently able to kind of offer top-down steerage on these big integrative efforts. So how can we do that? Well, these again are details of program design, which may not be quite as interesting for you, but these are things that UKERC is thinking about at the moment very much. I think we felt that there isn't enough explicit attention to many of these questions. So perhaps one of the suggestions was that we actually go out and find people who specialize in interdisciplinary studies and help them design the program with us. So I know Kathy, I saw Kathy in the room earlier, but Kathy Lyle has been quite involved in some of the thinking. She's been quite supportive in UKERC thinking on this. I think it's also important to be clear about the level of sort of ambition and expectation around what are you doing, bringing all these disciplines together, what are you expecting? And some suggestions about stage gating the money, and also to think about that, unfortunately, we do live in a world where there are separate research councils representing the social sciences, engineering and physical sciences, environmental sciences, and they have to see rewards for their own spending. So that is just become important. The research councils spend money for certain outcomes. So just to kind of round off, I think if you're engaged in policy-oriented research, you have to be responsive to these very big changes that we've seen. So this world of stability, hierarchy, identified expertise amongst a small set of people just doesn't exist anymore. So we've got highly dispersed, diverse institutions. I think it's particularly a UK condition. The role of business and public-private partnering has become much more powerful over the last 10 years, so a lot of the money is shaped by business interests on energy research. And we've also had the emergence of an urgency and accelerated change pressures. So how much of that is about energy and environment, and how much of it reflects other areas I'm quite interested in hearing about. The role for interdisciplinary whole systems research seems to me to have become more important, if anything, within this context. There are a huge number of reductive and partial kind of messages out there. So there's all kinds of silver bullets for energy problems which are being offered up to policymakers, to investors, to funding bodies. And I think that's become almost a more important job that interdisciplinary distancing and whole system perspective is supported. I think inevitably it is an individual orientation in many respects, and that doesn't change. And then lastly, to go back to the literature really, but this is a kind of ongoing intellectual, strategic and tactical challenge. So this is a kind of threads which aren't resolvable in any easy way, but very much a kind of cause worth fighting over. Any method has blind spots which focuses attention on selected aspects while blocking out others, and we're all guilty of that. STIS is just as oriented to its own areas of interest and inevitably blind spots as well. So how do we deal with this? So if we're serious about whole systems, it's about learning to kind of view problems with a variety of different approaches. One of our interviewees talked about this in terms of a modest disciplinary ego, that we have to be prepared to enter these engagements with a presumption that other disciplines have important things to say. And then this tricky business of assembling partial insights into something approximating a composite whole. So that's very kind of conditional and not you know, you never achieve a whole systems view, and you filled all the boxes across the system. But it is about maintaining an understanding of the relationship between the parts and the whole, having an appreciation of past, present, and future, and directing one's attention to particular areas of interest, which all of us do, but also maintaining a tentative, evolving appreciation of the whole. And I think that aspects of being tentative and evolving are quite difficult in an energy world where policymakers are pretty desperate for solutions, investors want investable projects, there is an emphasis on kind of moving rapidly to solutions, at least in many in the research world. And then I think there is an interesting kind of disciplinary institutional question, and I think Brewer's statement on this is interesting, that this is very much about the space at the margins. Don't try and convert the core businesses in the universities. This is about coexisting with dominant disciplinary and departmental paradigms. I don't know how that speaks to Johann's comment, but I think Brewer's point is very much about where interdisciplinarity has failed is when it's run up against very powerful interests within academia in terms of reinventing the institutions. And I suppose I'd echo that from 5 years' experience of research coordinating something like UKERC. That's it.